It all started with a sound. It was not a siren, but a whisper in the wind. It was the kind of low, sibilant rustle that you hear only when everything else is perfectly still. It was late afternoon, and the city was in that brief, quiet moment between the rush of the workday and the chaos of the evening commute. My name is Ethan, and I was on the 32nd floor of the old Blackwood Building, a towering metal and glass monolith that housed the city's central weather forecasting and atmospheric observation hub. It was an ironically serene place for what was about to unfold. I was hunched over a bank of monitors, my eyes scanning the live data streams from a dozen different meteorological stations across the metropolitan area. The air quality report was my main concern, a tedious but vital part of my job as a junior analyst. Today, it was all green, perfect, clean, untroubled. It was so flawless, in fact, that it felt wrong. It felt like the kind of silence before a scream. The building hummed around me with the soft whir of air conditioning units and the faint, rhythmic pulse of server racks. My supervisor, an older woman named Dr. Anya Sarah, was at her desk nearby, a cup of green tea steaming next to a mountain of paperwork. She was our resident expert on climate anomalies, a brilliant mind that saw patterns in the chaos of nature. Today, she was just checking her email. "Everything looking good, Ethan?" she asked, not looking up. "Too good," I muttered, my fingers dancing across the keyboard. Every sensor, every air intake, every atmospheric pressure gauge in the city is no pollutants, no particulate matter, not even an unusual pollen count. Dr. Sarah leaned back in her chair, frowning at my monitor. "Maybe it's a system glitch. Run a calibration sweep." I started the process but hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. My gut told me it wasn't a glitch. "It's like the system's holding its breath," I muttered. Across the office, Mark was eating chips too loudly, crumbs scattering across his desk. Mia, our senior analyst, was lecturing him on how salt corrodes keyboards. It was all so normal, so mundane. The normalcy felt staged. I glanced at the live cam feeds from our outlying stations, grainy video stills of rivers, bridges, and highways. In one frame, a flock of pigeons swirled above a rooftop, then broke formation suddenly, scattering in all directions as though something invisible had spooked them. Another feed showed a long stretch of highway, eerily empty, though rush hour should have begun. "Dr. Sarah, the northern station isn't reporting wind speeds," I said. She didn't look up. "Then file a maintenance ticket." "No, it's not malfunctioning, it's flatlined, no wind at all." That got her attention. She rolled her chair over, her green tea forgotten. "No wind? Not a breath. And the bird migration radar, look." I pulled up another screen. "Nothing. It's peak season. There should be thousands of blips moving south, but the airspace is empty." Her face tightened. "Birds don't just vanish." Mark laughed, mouth full. "Maybe they know something we don't." The joke hung in the air like a bad smell. No one laughed. I stared at the empty radar screen, the hollow grid lines stretching on forever. It felt like looking into a void. For the first time, I noticed the silence of the office. No phones ringing, no distant chatter, just the low hum of the servers and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Something was building. She looked up, a slight frown creasing her brow. "That's impossible. We're a city of 9 million people. There's always something." Just as she said that, a faint, high-pitched tone began to build in the air around us. It wasn't coming from the speakers or the intercom. It felt like it was coming from the very structure of the building itself, a frequency that vibrated through the floor and into the soles of my shoes. It was a single long note, climbing steadily, painfully, like the slow tightening of a wire. Dr. Sarah stood up, her hand flying to her ear. "What is that?" My phone, lying face down on my desk, buzzed violently. Then hers did. Then every phone in the office lit up at once, the same sharp, digital alert tone echoing through the room. I flipped my phone over. The screen was a jarring crimson red. "Emergency alert. Citywide protocol initiated. Unknown atmospheric anomaly detected. Shelter in place immediately. Do not attempt to exit building. Secure all entry points. This is not a drill." A chorus of gasps and muttered curses rippled through the office. People who had been laughing a second ago were now frozen, their faces pale. Cars moved along the streets below, tiny metal beetles scurrying in their lanes. Nothing looked out of place. But then, I saw it. At first, it was just a faint distortion on the horizon, a shimmering haze over the dense urban sprawl of the industrial district. "Dr. Sarah, look," I said. my voice barely a whisper as I pointed to the window. At first, I thought my eyes were tired. The horizon shimmered faintly, like heat waves rising from asphalt. But it wasn't hot. It was late autumn, the air crisp and cool. The shimmer thickened. I leaned closer to the window. Entire city blocks looked blurred, as though smeared by a thumb across a photograph. The distortion moved with intent, crawling forward. Probably industrial pollution, someone behind me muttered. They're always dumping something in the river. No, I whispered. That's not smoke. Smoke rises. This is... The words died in my throat. On the street below, traffic lights flickered from green to red, but the cars didn't move. A driver stepped out of his vehicle, looking toward the haze. His silhouette stood stark against the sunlit pavement, then blurred, then wavered, like a reflection on water. He stumbled, dropped to his knees, and vanished into the gray tide. Jesus Christ, Mia said, her voice cracking. Someone grabbed binoculars from the emergency kit. They focused on the haze, then dropped the glasses with a sharp gasp. It's swallowing the buildings. The shimmer wasn't just fog, it was erasing detail, color, shadow, shape. The concrete towers looked like wet paper dissolving in water. Hundreds of pigeons erupted from the rooftops, wings beating frantically. They spiraled higher, higher until the haze reached them. The flock went rigid in unison. Bodies stiffened mid-flight. They dropped like stones, raining down on the streets, vanishing into the moving wall of gray. I pressed my palm against the glass, my breath fogging the window. "Dr. Sarah," I whispered. "It's moving faster." She stepped to my side, her face an unreadable mask of scientific curiosity mixed with dawning horror. The gray wall was expanding, consuming the distant buildings, swallowing the sunlight. It wasn't rolling over the land. It was creeping, slithering, flowing into every crevice and alleyway. It moved like something alive, a slow-motion, tidal wave of utter emptiness. "What is that?" someone else asked, their voice trembling. The gray turned to a sickly, mottled white as it reached the nearest buildings. The air became thick, and a strange, sweet scent filled the room, like blooming jasmine mixed with something metallic and wrong. My eyes began to water, and my skin prickled with a faint, tingling sensation. Dr. Sarah moved quickly, her academic calm replaced by a primal urgency. "Everyone, away from the windows. Now, seal the air vents." She didn't need to say it twice. The room descended into controlled chaos. People grabbed desk chairs and pushed them against the glass. Others tore off their jackets, stuffing them under the doors. I, however, was paralyzed, my gaze fixed on the fog. It was already below us, a swirling, opaque blanket the cars that had been moving moments before were now just dark, motionless lumps engulfed by the advancing tide. The fog lapped against the building like a rising tide. Through the windows, I could see it pressing into the cracks between skyscrapers, filling alleys, rolling into subway grates. Then the fire alarms went off. A shrill, warbling scream filled the office, red strobes bathing the walls in pulses of bloody light. On the security monitors, I caught a glimpse of the lower levels, fog seeping through revolving doors, swallowing the marble lobby floor in a matter of seconds. "Impossible," Dr. Sarah muttered. "These buildings are sealed." The feed showed otherwise. The mist didn't push its way in. It bled through, oozing past steel seams as though solidity was only a suggestion. People in the lobby scattered like ants. The fog reached them in less than 5 seconds. Their screams never finished. The cameras shorted out one by one. Then came the sound. It was muffled at first, a faint, rhythmic pounding from somewhere far below. It was a frantic drumming, like hundreds of fists beating on the outside of a drum. It was coming from the building itself, from the floors below us. The sound grew louder, more desperate, mixed with the faint, wet sound of a scream that was cut short as if someone had turned off a switch. The internal security monitors flickered to life on one of the larger screens, a live feed from the lobby. The image was grainy, but clear enough. 2 of the receptionists were at the glass doors, their faces pressed against the panes, their hands clawing at the polish they were trying to get out. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass. A second figure, a security guard, was wrestling them back, his face a mask of frantic terror. The grainy feed showed the receptionists clawing at the locked doors. One of them, Marissa, was screaming soundlessly, her mouth open wide. The microphone wasn't working, but I could imagine the shrill edge of her voice. Behind her, the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. It didn't smear across the surface like smoke. It pressed inward, conforming to the shape of the doors, seeping into every seam. The second receptionist slammed her fists against the emergency release panel, her knuckles splitting open. Blood smeared the glass. The security guard tried to drag them back, his arms locked around their waists. His face was beet red with effort. And then Marissa's body jerked. Not away from the glass, into it. Her torso slammed against the pane as if something on the other side had yanked her. Her colleagues screamed and tried to pull her back, but her arms were stretched impossibly thin, her face distorting against the glass. The feed crackled, the pixels blurred. For a split second, I swore her eyes met the camera. They were wide, unblinking, already milk white. The guard let go and stumbled back. He was shaking his head, mouthing something over and over. "Don't open it! Don't open it!" The last image before the screen fizzled into static was Marissa's hand, pale and warped, pressed against the lens. Number 4, pre-monster hallway buildup, 400 words, slot between scrape, drag, and a hand slapped against the glass of the door. The sound was faint at first, like distant furniture being moved across tile. Then it grew sharper, closer. Scrape, drag, scrape, drag. Everyone froze. Mia ducked under her desk, her breathing ragged. Mark muttered a prayer under his breath, his voice breaking. "It's nothing," one of the technicians whispered. "Old building. Pipes shift. Metal expands." But he didn't sound convinced. Another scrape, closer now, right outside the office. A shadow flickered across the frosted glass wall, tall, misshapen. I leaned forward, straining to listen. The silence between each drag seemed to stretch on forever, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. It felt like the sound wasn't just outside, it was inside the building itself, traveling through the steel bones of the structure. Someone coughed, a tiny sound, but loud as a gunshot in the stillness. The scraping stopped. The office was so quiet I could hear the buzz of the emergency exit sign, a low electrical hum. Every eye darted to the door, and then thump, a hollow, wet impact against the glass. Suddenly, the screen went to static. "The power's gone out in the main atrium," Dr. Sarah said, her voice tight with panic. "The central systems are offline." Then the lights in our office flickered and died. The hum of the servers ceased. The only light left came from the glow of our phones and the emergency strips in the hallways. The air conditioning died, and the room grew warm, stuffy. The silence that fell over us was absolute and somehow more terrifying than any alarm. My phone buzzed again, another alert: avoid direct contact at all costs. The fog is a carrier. Do not engage with exposed individuals. They are considered hostile. Further instructions awaiting. Do not open doors. The new alert was a gut punch. A biological agent? That made the quiet screams and the sudden blackouts so much worse. It wasn't a chemical spill, it was something alive. My mind raced, trying to process the implications. Avoid contact. They are considered hostile. The phrase echoed in my head. Who were they? And what did it mean for them to be hostile? Static crackled from the old desk radio in the corner. At first, I thought it was feedback from the dead servers. Then faint words, broken, like someone whispering through sand. "Anyone hear me?" I froze. "Dr. Sarah, radio." She darted over, fiddled with the dials. The signal cut in and out, but fragments came through. "Not fog, it listens. Don't breathe it. They're already..." A horrible shriek drowned the voice. Then silence. The radio dial spun wildly on its own, the needle scraping back and forth. The last thing it landed on before cutting out completely was an old emergency broadcast frequency. Except instead of the usual monotone test tone, there was a sound like breathing. I looked around the room at my colleagues. Their faces were pale, illuminated by the cold glow of their phones. The panic in their eyes was no longer subtle. Dr. Sarah was at the internal supply closet, rummaging for something, her hands moving with a practiced speed. "We need to barricade the doors," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. We pushed the heavy oak conference table in front of the main office door, then stacked chairs on top of it. The thick glass doors that separated us from the main hallway were reinforced, but I had a sinking feeling they wouldn't hold against whatever was now in our building. Someone started to cry softly. It was Mark, our youngest analyst. He was only 21, fresh out of college, and he was shaking uncontrollably, his phone clutched to his chest. "My family," he sobbed. "I told them I'd call them when I got off work. I can't reach them." The silence hung heavy in the room. We all knew. The network was gone. The city was a ghost town. We were on an island, a tiny pocket of life floating in a sea of something unknown. That's when we heard it. Not a knock, not a slam, but a wet, dragging sound from the hallway. It was slow and rhythmic, like a heavy bag being pulled across a tiled floor. It scraped along the wall, getting closer. Scrape, drag, scrape, drag. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound stopped directly outside our door. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear the faint, high-pitched ringing in my ears, the sound of my own blood rushing. Then came a sound that was even worse than the dragging, a soft, guttural gurgle. It was a choked, wet noise, like someone trying to speak with a throat full of mud. It wasn't words. It was a sound that had forgotten how to be human. It was full of pain and a horrifying, mindless hunger. A hand slapped against the glass of the door, not a clean hand. Stretched and translucent, like it had been boiled. The fingers ended in what looked like blackened, elongated claws. It slid down the glass, leaving a slick, dark streak behind. We all stumbled back, a collective gasp of terror filling the room. Dr. Sarah stood in front of the barricade, a fire extinguisher clutched in her hands. Her face was ashen, but her eyes were cold, resolute. "Get back, everyone," she said, her voice a low growl. "Stay away from the door. Do not look out. Do not make a sound." The thing on the other side of the door seemed to sense our presence. It began to hit the door, not with a fist, but with the flat of its palm, a hollow, wet thump that resonated through the room. Thump, thump, thump. It was slow, patient, and methodical, each blow a reminder of what was waiting just inches away. One of the office chairs behind me scraped against the floor. It was Mark. He had his phone up to his face, the screen illuminating his tear-stained cheeks. He was trying to record a video, his hands shaking so badly that the image was just a blur of white light. "Mark, stop," I whispered, but he didn't hear me. The thumping stopped. I slipped into the stairwell. I told myself it was curiosity, but in truth, I just couldn't stand the panicked faces anymore. The 31st floor was unlit, the emergency strips glowing faintly. It smelled of mildew and dust, as though no one had been here in years. But what unsettled me most were the scratches. Deep gouges carved into plaster, long, uneven, running in parallel. Claw marks. And beneath the marks, words scrawled in faded ink. "Don't trust the alarms." The silence returned, but this time it was laced with an undeniable sense of intelligence. It was waiting, listening. A faint scratching sound began, not from the door, but from the walls, high up, above the ceiling tiles. I knew with a sudden, bone-deep certainty that this wasn't just a gas or a virus. This was a force that had invaded our world, and it was intelligent. It was in our vents, in our walls, and it had a purpose. We had only survived the first wave. The second, more terrifying one had just begun. The scratching above us was slow and deliberate, a sound of something moving with intent. It was not a scurrying sound, not like rats. It was a scrape, a pause, another scrape, like a dragging weight on metal. I looked up at the ceiling, at the old stained tiles with their thin metal frames. Dr. Sarah held the fire extinguisher, her knuckles white. Mark had stopped recording, his phone now a useless flashlight beam trembling on the floor. Mia, our senior data analyst, was curled into a ball under her desk, a hand pressed to her mouth, stifling a sob. "It's just the wind," someone finally whispered. "The building's just settling." But we all knew that was a lie. The air in the room was completely still. The hum of the building had died, the only sound the faint, panicked breathing of a dozen people. The scratching was directly above us now, a slow, methodical advance. It was no longer a question of what was outside the door. The real question was what was inside our ceiling. A faint, sickly sweet smell began to leak into the room. It was the same odor as the fog outside, but now it was stronger, more pungent. My throat began to feel raw, my eyes watered. The smell was the scent of rot and chemicals, a vile perfume that promised decay. "It's coming through the vents," I said, my voice hoarse. "It's getting in." Dr. Sarah's head snapped up. She dropped the extinguisher and ran to a large, industrial-sized roll of plastic sheeting that we used to cover sensitive equipment during maintenance. "Tape! I need all the tape you can find, now!" We scrambled, tearing through drawers and cabinets, finding a half-used roll of duct tape, a flimsy strip of packing tape, and several large rolls of masking tape from the supply closet. We worked quickly, frantically, tearing off strips and patching every seam, every crack we could find. We ripped off strips of the plastic sheeting and pressed them over the vents, hoping the makeshift seal would be enough. The scratching continued, but now it was punctuated by a new sound, a soft, wet clicking. It was a rhythmic sound, like a series of tiny, delicate bones being snapped together. It was directly over the air vent. "That's not from the vents," Mark said, his voice a terrified squeak. "It's inside the vent." The smell was overwhelming now. It burned in my nostrils and left a metallic taste in my mouth. I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my lungs. I ripped off a section of my shirt and held it over my mouth, the thin fabric providing no comfort. Dr. Sarah, seeing my distress, threw me a spare scarf from her bag. It was made of thick wool and smelled faintly of lavender. It was useless against the smell, but the gesture meant something. "We have to be quiet," she mouthed. "It can hear us." The clicking stopped. The silence returned, thicker and more menacing than before. We stood there, frozen, listening to nothing. I could hear Mark's soft whimpering, the sound of Mia's nails scratching at her desk. We were just waiting for a sign, for something to break the quiet. It came from outside the door, not with a bang or a sound, but with a horrifying, inhuman movement. Something was forcing its way through the gap at the bottom of the door, a slow, viscous flow of liquid. It was a thick, blackish-gray sludge, shiny and glistening in the dim light. It looked like oil and water, but it moved with an almost deliberate, sluggish will. It pooled at the base of the door, then began to spread across the carpet, leaving behind a faint, steaming residue. "Don't touch it," Dr. Sarah yelled, her voice a strained whisper. The liquid didn't just spread. It began to rise, a slow, creeping tide climbing the legs of the conference table. The table began to creak, and then, with a splintering groan, one of the legs buckled. The barricade collapsed, and the table crashed to the floor, the chairs clattering around it. There was a moment of panicked silence. The thing on the other side of the door had heard. The gurgling sound returned, closer now, and the wet, rhythmic thumping resumed. Thump, thump, thump. The door's metal frame began to dent, pushing inward with each blow. "It's not just a person," Mia cried, her voice rising to a shriek. "It's stronger." "Get back," Dr. Sarah commanded, pushing us toward the far side of the room, away from the door. But it was too late. The door tore from its hinges with a sickening shriek of tearing metal. The thing that stepped through was not a person. It was a mockery of one. A distorted nightmare made of twisted limbs and stretched, pallid skin. Its body was elongated, its arms dragging along the ground, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Its skin was translucent and swollen, and a thick, blackish-gray substance oozed from the pores of its body, leaving a trail on the floor. Its eyes were gone, replaced by two gaping black holes from which a faint, white vapor seemed to rise. It had the same sweet, chemical smell as the fog, but 100 times more potent. The thing looked up, its head snapping from side to side as it listened to our movements. It was blind, but it didn't need eyes. It was hunting by sound. It let out a low, wet gurgle that scraped against my eardrums. It started to move toward us, slowly at first, its limbs moving with a horrible, disjointed jerkiness. The sound it made was the same scrape and drag we had heard in the hallway. Its feet, if they could be called that, were malformed. Its toes fused together into grotesque flat pads. "Don't move," Dr. Sarah whispered. "Don't make a sound." Mark, however, couldn't stop. He was shaking so hard that his phone, still in his hand, clattered to the floor with a loud slap. Its gurgle intensified and its pace quickened. It was moving faster now, its dragging gait becoming a lurching, stumbling run. It was a predator, and it had found its prey. Mark scrambled backward, his body a tight, panicked knot. The creature was on him in an instant. It didn't scream or growl. It made a sickening, wet, tearing sound as it fell on him. Mark let out a single high-pitched shriek, and then silence. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The thing was feasting. It was not using teeth or claws. It was simply absorbing him. The blackish-gray substance that oozed from its skin began to crawl over Mark's body, enveloping him, dissolving him. His body began to swell, and his skin turned a mottled gray. He was being assimilated, not eaten. The creature was merging with him, consuming him from the outside in. The sight was too much. I looked away, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. Mia was next to me, her body rigid with terror. "Doctor." Sarah, however, was still a rock. She raised the fire extinguisher. "Ethan, now!" she yelled. I didn't understand. She threw the extinguisher at the creature. It bounced off its head with a dull thud. The creature didn't even flinch. But the extinguisher, an old, heavy-duty model, had hit it hard. The gauge had cracked, and the contents, a white, powdery substance, began to spray from the small fissure. The creature stumbled back, the hissing of the extinguisher confusing it. "The air!" Sarah screamed, her face a mask of furious determination. "It's sensitive to the chemicals. It's how it hunts." The creature was recoiling from the white powder, its limbs flailing. The hissing sound was an irritant, a constant, high-frequency distraction. "We have to move," she said, her voice a low command. "The server room, it's sealed off. It has an independent air filtration system. Go." I grabbed Mia's hand and pulled her up. We ran, scrambling over the collapsed barricade and past the writhing horror that was once Mark. The server room was at the end of the hallway, a small, insulated room with a heavy steel door and a keypad lock. Sarah was already there, her fingers flying across the keypad. "The code," Mia sobbed. "I don't remember the code. It's a biometric lock, not a code." Dr. Sarah snapped, a flicker of panic in her eyes. "My thumbprint. It's the only way in." The creature was recovering. The hiss of the fire extinguisher was dying down, and the creature was beginning to turn its head toward the sound of our feet. "Hurry," I urged. Dr. Sarah pressed her thumb against the small black sensor on the door. Nothing happened. She tried again and again. The scanner beeped a red error. "What's wrong?" I yelled. "My hands are shaking," she said, her voice filled with a desperate, frantic edge. "It won't read my print." The creature was gaining on us, its gurgling a constant, horrifying soundtrack to our escape. I looked at Mia, at her pale, tear-streaked face. Then I looked at Dr. Sarah. There was a faint, almost invisible tremor in her hands. The terror had finally gotten to her. "Let me try," I said. "You're too scared." She stared at me, a mixture of disbelief and fury in her eyes. "I am not scared. We are not losing this." But the creature was right behind us. I could hear its wet, dragging footsteps. I could smell the sickly scent of the fog on it. My blood ran cold. "Mia," I said, "the server room has a secondary entrance through the maintenance shaft. Do you remember the plans?" Mia's eyes went wide. She had helped with the building's blueprints. She had the schematics on her computer. She was a genius with that kind of stuff. She nodded slowly, her terror replaced by a sudden, frantic hope. "The old elevator shaft," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The access hatch is in the ceiling of the supply room. It leads to the ventilation shaft. It connects to the server room's independent filter, but it's small. It's a crawl space." "It's our only way," I said. The creature was almost at the door. I could see the faint white mist swirling from its eye sockets. I could hear the wet, rasping sound of its breathing. "Go!" Dr. Sarah yelled, her voice a final, desperate plea. "Go now. I'll hold it off." She turned to face the creature, the useless fire extinguisher clutched in her hands like a cudgel. I didn't hesitate. I pulled Mia with me and ran. I didn't look back. The last sound I heard before we slammed the supply room door shut was the horrifying, gurgling roar of the creature, followed by a wet, sickening crunch. And then silence. Mia and I were alone. We were in a small, cramped room filled with boxes of paper, cleaning supplies, and discarded office equipment. The air was thick with the smell of dust and bleach. I flicked on my phone's flashlight. The beam danced across the ceiling, illuminating a small metal grate. "That's it," Mia said, her voice shaking. "That's the access hatch." I found a small stepladder in the corner and dragged it over. I climbed it, my heart pounding in my chest, and pushed at the grate. It was sealed tight with rusty bolts. I tried to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge. I needed a wrench, a screwdriver, something. Panic began to set in, a cold, creeping sensation that was worse than any monster. We were trapped. The monster that was once a person was just on the other side of the door, and we had no way out. The scratching from the ceiling began again, louder and more insistent than before. The thing that had been waiting patiently in the vents was here, and it was hungry. The scraping sound above us was no longer a gentle shifting. It was a hungry, insistent sound, like 1,000 nails dragging across metal. It was a noise that promised a slow, agonizing entry. My hands, trembling, tried to twist the rusted bolts of the vent cover, and they were fused with rust, and I couldn't get a grip. Mia stood on the floor below, her face a mask of terror, holding a small silver pen in her hand as if it could protect her. "It won't budge," I whispered, my voice raw from the chemical air. "I need a tool, anything." The door to the supply room shuddered, a faint, wet thudding. The creature that had come in from the hallway was now trying to get in here. We were trapped between two things, a slow death above and a fast, horrible one behind us. Mia's eyes were darting around the small room, searching for an answer. She spotted an old metal fire extinguisher, its red paint flaking off. It was heavy, a blunt instrument of last resort. "That!" she yelled, pointing at it. "The extinguisher." I jumped down from the stepladder. I grabbed the extinguisher. It was a useless weapon against the creature outside, but the nozzle was made of solid, heavy brass. It was a tool. I climbed back up the ladder and began to smash the brass nozzle against the bolts on the vent cover. The sound was deafening in the small enclosed space, a jarring clang that echoed off the walls. I swung and swung again, the force of each blow sending a shockwave up my arm. The bolts bent, but they didn't break. The thudding on the door grew more urgent, more frantic. I heard a wet, guttural scream on the other side. The thing was getting angry. The scraping above me intensified, a hurried, panicked scratching. The thing in the vent knew it was in a race with the thing outside. "It's coming," Mia screamed. "It's coming, Ethan." I swung again, a desperate final blow. The last bolt sheared off with a screech of tortured metal. The grate sagged inward, and a cloud of the sickly sweet fog billowed down into the room. I jumped off the ladder, grabbing Mia's hand and pulling her with me, away from the vent. From the hole in the ceiling, a pale, glistening tentacle dropped down. It was a thick, segmented appendage, translucent and throbbing, with a number of suckers on the underside that pulsed with a faint, milky light. It moved slowly at first, its tips searching the air, sensing for our presence. "Run!" I yelled. "Run! Get under the tables!" We scrambled, ducking under a large metal shelving unit and a stack of old filing cabinets. The tentacle retracted, then dropped again, this time with greater speed and precision. It was now a thin, elongated strand, like a needle searching for a vein. It slid through the air unerringly toward the small space where we were hiding. "It can sense us," Mia whispered, her body trembling. "It knows where we are." The tentacle touched the side of the shelving unit, and where it made contact, the metal began to sizzle and hiss. A section of the gray paint turned black and peeled away, revealing a dark, viscous substance underneath. The thing was corrosive. It was a creeping, hungry organism, and the fog was just its first form, a way for it to find a host. I saw an old, rusted container of cleaning acid tucked away under the bottom shelf. It was marked with a skull and crossbones. This was a place for forgotten things, for things too dangerous to be kept in the open. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the cold metal surface. "Don't touch it," Mia screamed, grabbing my arm. "It's acid. It'll burn you." "It's a chance," I said, my voice low and determined. "It's the only chance we have." The tentacle was retracting, but the black substance it left on the metal was still sizzling, bubbling. It was dissolving the shelf. I grabbed the container, its metal cold and slick with condensation. I fumbled with it, my hands slick with sweat and fear. The tentacles dropped again, this time a dozen of them, thin, translucent strands like fishing lines, dangling from the hole in the ceiling. One of them touched my hand. A searing, blinding pain shot up my arm. I cried out, the container of acid slipping from my fingers. I looked at my hand. My skin was turning a sickly white, a fine mist rising from the surface as the tentacle dissolved my flesh. I shook my hand violently, a frantic, desperate attempt to get it off. It clung to me, its suckers pulsating, its grip growing tighter. Mia, seeing my agony, screamed and picked up the fire extinguisher. She didn't aim for the tentacles. She aimed for the ceiling, for the origin of the tentacles. She blasted the dry chemical powder upward into the vent. The hissing sound was the only thing I heard. The tentacles recoiled, a frantic, wet thrashing as they withdrew. The one attached to my hand pulled away with a sickening, tearing sound, leaving a raw, blistering mess of flesh and bone behind. I fell to the floor, panting, the pain a white-hot agony that consumed my entire being. Mia knelt beside me, her eyes wide with horror, her hands trembling as she looked at my ruined hand. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice a sob. "Oh my God, Ethan." I gritted my teeth. The pain was unbearable, but I pushed it down. "The acid," I said, my voice strained. "Get the acid." Mia, her hands shaking, grabbed the container. The lid was still on. She struggled with it, her fingers fumbling with the rusted metal. The gurgling from the door intensified. The pounding was now a rhythmic, furious smashing. The metal of the door was buckling, groaning under the immense force from the other side. A deep, inhuman growl reverberated through the room. "Hurry, Mia," I whispered, my voice faint. "Please, hurry." She let out a frustrated cry. She couldn't open it. The lid was too tight, the rust too old. She looked at me, her face pale. She was going to give up. I saw it in her eyes. The terror had won. "Mia," I said, a little louder. Look at me, Mia. We're not going to die here. We're going to get out of this. We can do this. You can do this. Just think. Use your brain. You're the smartest one here." She stared at me, her eyes clouded with tears. She was a data analyst, a genius. Not a fighter, not a survivor, but I had to make her one. I reached for my phone with my good hand, the one that wasn't burning with a caustic fire. I fumbled for the camera app. I had to record this. I had to show what was happening. This wasn't a chemical spill. This was something else. Something alive. The screen flickered to life. The camera was pointed at Mia, her face illuminated by the harsh white glow. "We have to get out," she said, her voice a cracked whisper. I looked at her, then at my phone. "The acid. Use the phone. Break the seal." She looked at me, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. She looked at the phone in my hand. Then her eyes widened. She understood. The phone was hard and heavy, a perfect tool to use against the lid. She grabbed my phone, her hands surprisingly steady now. She placed the container on the ground and began to slam the phone against the lid, not with force, but with a series of quick, sharp taps, like a tiny hammer. The clicks and taps were a strange, frantic symphony in the small room. The lid began to turn, slowly at first, then faster. With a final, victorious squeal, it popped off. Mia held the open container, her hands shaking again. The tentacles were already descending from the ceiling, their tips twitching, their milky white light a beacon of doom. "The grate," I said, my voice barely audible over the sound of the pounding door. "Pour it onto the grate. Now!" She didn't hesitate. She threw the full container of acid. It hit the ceiling with a resounding clang, a spray of the clear, corrosive liquid splashing across the metal grate and the surrounding ceiling tiles. A horrific shriek erupted from the space above us, a sound that was not human, a sound of agony and rage. The tentacles thrashed and writhed, sizzling and dissolving in the acid. The tentacle that had burned my hand shriveled and fell to the floor with a soft, wet plop. A black, oily substance dripped from the hole in the ceiling, a stinking rain of death. The shriek died down, replaced by a low, defeated gurgle. The thing in the ceiling was retreating, in pain, wounded. The pounding on the door stopped. We were alone again, but the silence was not a relief. It was a profound, suffocating emptiness. We had won a battle, but the war was far from over. Mia, her body shaking, knelt beside. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and triumph. "We did it," she whispered. We survived." I looked at my hand. The skin was peeling away, a raw, angry wound that was already beginning to swell. The pain was still there, but it was a dull, thumping ache now, a constant reminder of what had happened. I knew I needed to do something about it, but what? "We have to go," I said, my voice a strained rasp. "Now. We have to find another way out." I stood up, pushing through the searing pain in my hand. I looked at the door. The creature was still out there. It was wounded, but it was still out there. We couldn't go that way. I looked at the ceiling. The thing in the vents was still up there. It was wounded, but it was still up there. We couldn't go that way either. We were trapped. Mia was looking at the small space between the shelves and the cabinets where we had been hiding. Her eyes were fixed on the back wall. She pointed with a trembling finger. "Ethan," she said, her voice full of a new, dawning horror. Look. I looked at the back wall, a dark, dusty, and unmarked surface. I didn't see anything at first. Then my eyes adjusted to the dim light. There were scratches on the wall, not from the creature in the ceiling, but from a long, long time ago. They were not random, but formed a strange, elaborate pattern, a series of interlocking circles and lines. It was a message. It was a warning. It had been here before. Suddenly, I remembered something. The schematics Mia had looked at. I recalled her saying something about an old elevator shaft and a ventilation system. I looked up at the ceiling, then at the back wall. The scratches were a map, a guide. I knew where we had to go. The question wasn't what was in the building. It was what had always been in the building, dormant, waiting for a signal. The fog was the signal. We were not just running from a monster. We were running from something big. The scratches on the back wall of the supply room weren't random. They were old, a fading memory of a long ago panic. I stared at them, my mind a blur of pain from my hand and the terrifying knowledge of what was waiting for us. I traced the pattern with my good hand. It was a series of overlapping circles and a central point, a map. Mia was beside me, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. "What is it?" she whispered. "It's a map," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The building's old schematics. This place, it's a trap. It's always been one." The map led to the back of the room, to an area that had been walled off and forgotten. There was a faint seam in the concrete, almost invisible in the dim light. It was a door, a hidden entrance to a maintenance shaft that led to the old, abandoned elevator system. The kind of place no one would ever think to look. The kind of place that could be a way out. I needed something to break through the concrete. My eyes landed on the rusted metal fire extinguisher, the same one that had saved us from the thing in the ceiling. It was heavy and it was solid. It was the only tool we had left. Mia and I worked together, smashing the blunt end of the extinguisher against the seam in the wall. The sound was a loud, jarring series of thuds that echoed in the small room. We took turns, our fear giving us a manic, desperate strength. The concrete chipped, then cracked, and a fine, gray dust filled the air. We could hear the thumping from the hallway door again, and the scratching from the ceiling. They were both still out there, hungry, and they knew where we were. Finally, with a loud crack, a section of the wall broke away, revealing a dark, claustrophobic opening. It was a small crawl space, no more than 3 feet high, and it reeked of stale air and mildew. Beyond it, a set of rusted metal rungs disappeared into the darkness. It was an access shaft leading down. "You first," I said, pushing Mia gently toward the hole. She hesitated, looking into the blackness. "What if it's a dead end?" "Then we die together," I said. "But at least we tried. At least we fought back." She nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a clean line down her dust-smeared cheek. She crawled into the opening, her body disappearing into the dark. I followed, pulling the heavy extinguisher with me. I didn't know if it would be useful, but it felt wrong to leave it behind. We climbed down the metal rungs, the rust flaking off on our hands. The shaft was cold and damp, and the only light came from the beam of my phone's flashlight, illuminating a small circle of our descent. After what felt like an eternity, we landed on a narrow metal platform. It was the top of an old, disused elevator. The shaft swallowed us in damp, metallic silence. Every rung creaked under our weight, flakes of rust raining down into the dark. My injured hands screamed with every grip, slick with sweat and blood, but I couldn't let go. Not here. Not now. Mia climbed above me, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam cut through the black like a surgical knife, revealing only fragments, rusted bolts, dangling wires, a thick sheen of mold crawling over the walls. The air grew colder the deeper we went, carrying with it the smell of stagnant water and something older, something sour. "Keep moving," I whispered. She nodded but didn't answer. Her breath came fast, panicked, echoing down the shaft. The sound felt too loud, bouncing off the steel until it seemed like the darkness itself was breathing with us. Halfway down, we passed a broken maintenance platform. It hung lopsided, one chain snapped, the other groaning with strain. My flashlight caught the outline of something on it, shapes slumped in a pile. For a heartbeat, I thought it was debris. Then I saw the clothes, torn jackets, shoes with feet still inside them. Bodies. The skin was gray and papery, fused to the metal floor as though the fog had seeped into their pores and glued them down like insects in resin. Their mouths were open in frozen screams, teeth blackened, eyes nothing but hollow pits. Maya's breath hitched. I wanted to cover her mouth to stop the sound, but my hands were full. "Don't look," I said, too late. One of the corpses shifted. A brittle cracking noise like ice breaking on a frozen lake. For a second I thought it would rise, but it didn't. It just listened. We moved faster. The rungs below my feet shook. At first I thought it was my imagination. Then the sound followed. Scrape, drag, scrape. Something was climbing down the shaft with us. The darkness below was no longer empty. It was moving. "Faster," I hissed. My lungs burned, my vision spotted, but I forced myself down rung after rung. The sound was getting closer. When we finally reached the bottom platform, I nearly collapsed onto the rusted grate. The echo of scraping metal still reverberated above us. something was coming. And the elevator car overhead, it had started to move. The elevator was a relic, its metal walls a mosaic of rust and grime. It was not in use, and its cables were thick with dust. But I saw what I was looking for. A small metal maintenance hatch, just big enough for a person to squeeze through, was set in the floor of the elevator. The map on the wall had shown it. It was our way in. I used the extinguisher to pry the hatch open. It groaned on its hinges, but it gave way. We dropped through, landing in the small, cramped space below the elevator car. It was a small, empty chamber. On the far wall, a metal vent, much larger than the one in the supply room, was set into the concrete. It was the ventilation system, the independent one that led to the server room. We had found it. Mia and I pushed the vent cover, but it was solid, bolted shut from the other side. This was a fail-safe, a way to keep the contaminated air out. We needed something to get it open. My heart sank. The extinguisher was a blunt instrument, but it wasn't going to get through a solid metal vent. We were trapped again. Suddenly, a loud, grating thump sounded from above us. We looked up. The elevator car began to descend, slowly at first, then faster. The cables that had been still for decades were now groaning, straining under a new, immense weight. "Something's on top of it," Mia whimpered. The thumping grew louder, more frantic. The thing that had been in the ceiling, the one we had wounded, was on the roof of the elevator. It was trying to smash its way down to us. I looked at the vent, then at the elevator car. There was no time. We were out of options. Then I saw something I hadn't noticed before. At the bottom of the wall, where the vent met the floor, a small circular metal plate was bolted to the concrete. It had a small keyhole. A keyhole? I remembered the key I had found in the sample script. The one marked roof access. It wasn't the way to the roof. It was a failsafe, a way to open the vent. I reached into my pocket, my hands shaking. The key was still there. I fumbled with it, my fingers slick with sweat. I inserted the key, turned it, and a quiet, satisfying click echoed in the small chamber. I pulled the handle, and the heavy metal vent swung open. A gust of cool, clean air rushed over us, a glorious, revitalizing current that washed away the chemical stench. "Go," I said, pulling Mia into the tunnel. "Go now!" We crawled through the ventilation system. It was a tight squeeze, a narrow, dark space. The air was cool and clean. We were safe for now. As we crawled, I could hear the sounds of the elevator above us, the groaning of metal, the splintering of concrete. The thumping was frantic now, a desperate, furious sound. Finally, we reached the end of the tunnel. A small metal grate led into a room. I pushed it open, and we tumbled into a large, cold, and dark space. It was the server room. The air was crisp, clean, and filled with the gentle hum of electronics. The lights were out, but the glow of dozens of small screens filled the room, casting an eerie blue light. The room was pristine. It was a hermetically sealed world, a safe haven from the horror outside. We were safe. I turned to Mia, a triumphant grin on my face. She looked at me, a soft, tired smile on her face. Then the smile faded. She looked at her hand. It was red and swollen. A faint white mist was rising from the surface of her skin, the same mist that had risen from my own hand when the tentacle touched it. The poison was in her. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. The thing in the ceiling. The screens in the room began to flicker. One by one, they turned on, a cascade of blue light illuminating the room. An emergency broadcast signal began to flash on one of the larger monitors. I looked at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't a warning, it was a message, a live broadcast. On the screen, a man in a hazmat suit stood in a pristine white room. His face was a mask of cold, scientific detachment. "The fog has been contained," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "The incident was a biological experiment gone wrong. The subject is considered a success." The screen cut to a new image, a grainy black and white image of the thing from the hallway, the elongated limbs, the sickening gurgle. A red arrow pointed to a small, circular device on its back, half buried in the flesh. It was a tracking beacon, a control device. The image shifted again, dozens of screens in a grid, each showing a different location in the city. Office buildings, apartment complexes, a school gymnasium. In every feed, survivors huddled in small groups, pale faces illuminated by phone screens. And in every feed, the fog was at the door. "They can hear us," the man in the hazmat suit continued, his voice clinical, detached. "Their auditory sensitivity exceeds projection. Silence is recommended. Observation will continue. Another screen, a hospital ward. Nurses barricaded doors with gurneys. One by one, they were dragged away, screaming as a gray appendage slipped through the vents. These are not errors, the man said. This is data. The word made my stomach turn. They are hosts. The integration phase is proceeding faster than expected. In 73% of trials, assimilation completes within 10 minutes of exposure. Resistance is negligible. The screen flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw us. A grainy view of the server room from a corner camera showing Mia and me staring at the monitor, then static. We believe a small, isolated group of individuals may have survived the initial phase, the man in the hazmat suit said. They are being monitored. The fog is just the first stage. The next stage is... He didn't finish the sentence. The screen went to static. The lights in the server room flickered and died. The hum of the servers ceased. The emergency lights didn't come on. We were in total darkness. And then I heard it. A faint, high-pitched scratching sound. Not from the vents, from the walls, from inside the building itself. The fog was gone, but the true monster, the thing that had been growing in the walls, the thing that had been awakened, was now free. I looked at Mia, her face a pale, tear-streaked blur in the darkness. We weren't safe. We had just sealed ourselves in a room with a brand new threat. We were the last two survivors in a game that was just beginning. The whispers on the wind had been a warning, but the whispers in the walls were a promise. A promise of a slow, agonizing death.